had a lot of fun making this video, and if you like US political or historical trivia, this video is going to be fun for you too. Now, there are 29 states that have never served as the birthplace of a United States president. But how close have they come? How close have they come to putting somebody in the White House? Each state clearly has big important people. So in this video, we're going to look at each of those 29 states, and I'm going to give you my opinion as to who is the closest thing that state has to a president. Be sure to stick around until the end when I share my picks for Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Maryland. I think those will be my three most controversial picks. Now, if you go back and look at the preceding video, it talks about the 21 states that have served as the birthplace of United States presidents. But just because a president is born in a state doesn't mean that that's the state most associated with the individual. And there are a number of these 29 states that are more associated with the president than the president's birthplace. For example, our current president, Joe Biden, was the U.S. Senator from Delaware for 36 years. Sure, Joe Biden was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, but most people associate Joe Biden with Delaware. So even though he wasn't born in Delaware, Joe Biden is Delaware's president. Similarly, Dwight Eisenhower, he was born in Texas, but most people associate him with Kansas. His presidential library is in Abilene, and Ike considered Abilene his hometown. Gerald Ford was born in Omaha, Nebraska, but that's not the state that most people associate with Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford is a Michigander in most people's minds. Ford graduated from the University of Michigan, and he also helped Michigan win 2 national titles in football. More importantly, he was a U.S. congressman from Michigan for 24 years. He is buried in Michigan, and his library is in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Indiana has not served as the birthplace of a U.S. president, but Benjamin Harrison was mostly associated with Indiana. He led the 70th Indiana Regiment in the Civil War. He was a senator from Indiana from 1881 to 1887, and he beat Grover Cleveland to become president in 1889. And Teddy Roosevelt is the last president that we'll put in this adopted son category. Yes, Teddy was governor of New York before he became president, but he had a long relationship with the state of North Dakota. He built a ranch in North Dakota in 1884. He wrote 3 books about life in North Dakota. The Theodore Roosevelt National Park is located in North Dakota, and it is the only national park that is named after an individual. So moving on from adopted sons, we're going to look at presidential candidates, nominees of political parties that ran for president but lost. For example, Al Gore from Tennessee. He was a senator from Tennessee for 8 years. He was vice president for 8 years, and he became the Democratic nominee for president in 2000. He carried 20 states and won 266 electoral votes. He lost the presidency because of a Supreme Court decision that essentially gave the office to George W. Bush. Second in this category is Mitt Romney from Utah, a Republican nominee for president in 2012. He carried 24 states and won 206 electoral votes. Now, Arizona also falls into this category. I was thinking Barry Goldwater initially, but then when I started doing research, it's actually John McCain who came closest to becoming president as an Arizonan. In 1964, Goldwater won only 6 states and carried 52 electoral votes. In 2008, John McCain carried 22 states and won 173 electoral votes. Now, Maine had a very similar situation with a guy named James G. Blaine. He carried 18 states in the 1884 election. Hubert Humphrey in the 1968 election is the closest Minnesota ever came to putting a president in the White House. In the 68 election, Humphrey won 13 states and 191 electoral votes. West Virginia had a Democratic nominee for president in 1924. His name was John W. Davis, and he carried 12 states and won 136 electoral votes before losing to Calvin Coolidge. George Wallace is the closest that Alabama has come to putting a man in the White House as an independent candidate in the 1968 election. Wallace won 5 states and 46 electoral votes. George McGovern, he was born in Avon, South Dakota, and he was the Democratic nominee for president in 1972. He ran against Richard Nixon. McGovern did not fare very well in his bid to become president. He carried only Massachusetts and the District of Columbia, received only 17 electoral votes. Gary Johnson, former New Mexico governor, he was the Libertarian nominee for president in 2012 and 2016. And you know what? In 2016, he actually carried some votes. He won 4.5 million votes, or 3.3% of the popular vote, far better than any other libertarian candidate in history. So we're done with the adoptive sons and the party nominees for president. Now we're going to move on to a more subjective category. People who were never president, people who were never nominees, but subjectively, they just seem like they were the closest thing that the state has to a president. And the first person I'm going to mention in this regard is from Louisiana. It's former Governor Huey Long. It was believed that Huey Long was going to challenge FDR for the presidency in 1936, but he was assassinated on September 10th, 1935. I think that he is by far the most famous politician in Louisiana history. In Idaho, we got to go with a guy named William Borah. He won 5 primaries in the 1936 presidential election. He went to the Republican National Convention expecting to be nominated as the Republican candidate, but Alf Landon was nominated instead. And it doesn't matter because Borah would have been beaten by FDR in any event. I'm going to call Dick Cheney as the closest thing that Wyoming has ever had to a president. He was vice president, of course, under George W. Bush, and many saw him as the power behind the throne during the Bush administration. In Wisconsin, we got to go with Charles Dawes, the vice president of the United States under Calvin Coolidge from 1925 to 1929. Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor to George W. Bush. The would-be president from Colorado, she moved from Alabama to Colorado when she was 13. She went to high school there, she went to college there, she got a BA and a PhD from the University of Denver. Rhode Island was a really difficult state, lots of founding fathers from Rhode Island, but since the ratification of the Constitution, all I can find is Tommy Corcoran. I think he came closest to the White House. He was an advisor to FDR, part of the brain trust that planned and implemented the New Deal. He was also a close friend and advisor to LBJ. Montana, I'm going to go with Mike Mansfield, Senate Majority Leader from 1961 to 1977. Washington State, I'm going to go with Warren Magnuson, who represented Washington 44 years in D.C. and was a senator from 1944 to 1981. In Oregon, I'm going to go with Senator Mark O. Hatfield. He was Oregon's senator for 30 years, and he was governor for 8 years. He never lost an election over the course of 46 years and 11 campaigns. In my opinion, Harry Reid is the closest thing that Nevada ever had to a president. He represented the state in D.C. from 1983 to 2015, and he was the leader of the Senate Democrats from 2005 to 2017. Now, Florida was another surprise. I thought there would be more people to choose from, but Spessard Holland, he was the closest that Florida ever came to the White House. He was a senator from 1946 to 1971, and he led the effort to pass the 24th Amendment, which banned poll taxes. Alaska, I'm going to go with Ted Stevens, a U.S. senator from 1968 to 2009. He was the longest-serving Republican senator in U.S. history. Eventually, his career came to an end because he was convicted of failing to report gifts. Those convictions were ultimately overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct. He's got an airport and a Navy destroyer named after him, so there's that consolation. Now, the last 3 states were really difficult. They were just really difficult. I tried to choose historical figures, people who were leaders from these states who had national and international reputations. I think these are maybe the 3 most interesting candidates or politicians on this entire list. So the first one I'm going to go with is Quanah Parker for the state of Oklahoma. He was the last chief of the Comanches, and he served in that role from 1890 to 1911. If you have any doubts as to the historical significance of Quanah Parker, just read the book Empire of the Summer Moon. It's a great book. Now, my most controversial pick is probably going to be my pick for Mississippi because, well, Mississippi did have a president, but he just wasn't president of the United States. He was president of the Confederacy. And of course, that individual would be Jefferson Davis. But given his historical significance, I think Jefferson Davis is the guy I got to put in this position, the guy from Mississippi. And finally, Maryland. I'm surprised that Maryland went so far down this list, but there are really very, very few significant politicians on a federal level that come from Maryland. The one that immediately jumped to mind was former Vice President Spiro Agnew, who was Vice President for Richard Nixon. But Agnew's career as a politician was relatively short. He was only in public office for about 6 years between being governor of Maryland and vice president. And of course, that all ended because of corruption. So I didn't want to give it to Spiro Agnew. So I'm giving Maryland to the one, the only Frederick Douglas. Of course, Douglas never held public office because his whole career was dedicated to abolishing slavery. He was an abolitionist, and he lived from 1838 to 1895. But for the time period that he was born in, the guy could have done anything on any level he wanted to, and he's still one of the most revered public figures in U.S. history. So there you have it. If I messed up your state, if I picked someone that you disagree with, let me know. Again, if you've stuck with me this long, you must like this kind of stuff too. Thanks.